So for our final episode of season 2 of My Ordinary Life podcast, I'm handing the role of host over to Anthony. Anthony's been a member of our Stop People Dying Too Young group for 6 years, and he has volunteered to host a panel of experts whose jobs all involve death and dying. We've gathered questions from the group, which Anthony is going to ask the panel. So now over to Anthony.
So I have a list, got 3 questions for each and every one of you to give you your opinion about death and dying. So I'll start off with Katy.
Hello.
Hello, my love. So the question is, what happens to you when you die?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and then how that relates to that question.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not religious, so I don't have any faith beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I would also like to say that I leave space for not knowing everything about what happens when we die, but I'll tell you what I think happens, and then it'd be interesting to hear what other people say. So I think that when we die, our body stops working, and when our body stops working, we as a person aren't here anymore, but our body is left, and then we have to do something with the dead body, and there are some options around what those things are, and what people do when somebody dies is different depending on their background and beliefs. Yeah, is that a good starting point for this?
So, to be honest, I should have said this before we start. There's no right or wrong.
Okay, thank you.
That's good to know.
Yeah, I mean, I could be wrong if someone asked me that. So
no, and they're big. These are big questions. So I feel like that might be a good starting point, and then it would be. We've got people from very different sort of experiences here who'll be able to flesh that out.
Yeah, and same thing goes to Lisa. So what happens when we die?
So when I heard that question, I've thought of something a little bit different about what happens when you die.
Yeah.
And I'm a doctor, so I kind of think I thought a little bit about the lead up to when you're dead and what happens during that process. So for me, I always think a little bit like a clock that's winding down. So everything's starting to get slower. It's not ticking as well, your body, and your organs start to stop working. And one of the biggest organs that gets affected is your brain. And as you know, your brain's the thing that makes you who you are as a person, all your personality, being able to talk about who you are. So when your brain stops working, actually what we tend to see as doctors and nurses, so again, I'm coming at a slightly different way, is that people start to sleep more. Mm-hmm. So normally, we'll all have our own time when we're awake and when we're asleep. For me, I'm kind of tucked up in bed by 9 o'clock, but I'm awake at 5 a.m. But what we tend to see when people are starting that dying process is they spend more and more time asleep. They do then wake up, and then that time are able to do things and plan and talk to people. But that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where the sleep becomes a different type of sleep, where people don't wake up, and then they become unconscious. So, when you're asleep, someone can wake you, wake up, wake up. When you're unconscious, you can't wake up. So people spend more time unconscious, and then eventually that ticking clock slows down even more, and the brain's unconscious, and then the brain stops working. And when that properly stops working, then we stop breathing. And for most people, that's a natural death process. And I would say that's the biggest, kind of commonest way that I see people die. So things slowing down, winding down gradually, time that you're awake is much less, and then actually hitting that phase where you become unconscious and you can't be woken up. Mm-hmm. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Alex?
As a funeral doctor, I don't get to see the sort of the lead up to death. Well, it's very rare that I do. Mm-hmm. I only really see death after death has occurred. So I only see a dead person afterwards. So I can really only give my side of things of when I'm involved with helping a family and what happens after a death has occurred, which is really transferring a deceased from the place of death. If that's in a care setting, such as a care home or nursing home, that's from the room that they're usually in. But if it's in a hospital, often there's a hospital mortuary. So I'll go to the hospital mortuary, or if it's in a home, like their own private home, then it'll be wherever they have died within the home, whether that be the settee or their bedroom or somewhere in between. And that's the point that I get involved with bringing somebody into care. So that's really kind of the first initial steps that I get involved with a dead person. And then from there, it's essentially sort of what the family's wishes are and for guidance that I can offer and give to the family on the next steps that follow in the days beyond a death occurring. So I don't have the privilege of seeing people leading up to die. Yeah. So it's really then following wishes after death as kind of what the family want and whether they're to be dressed and things like that. So I then follow on from what happens after death. But the initial phase is bringing into care and looking after that loved one of that family's in a dignified way, which usually means that they're covered. So even if they're in their pajamas, there's still a shroud over them, and that they're at rest. And usually that's in a temperature control facility is the usual way. And then it's just awaiting permission from the family on what action needs to take place next. A funeral doctor can never proceed without the family's written permission. And that's really important to make that clear to people.
All right, and lastly, Gemma.
Emma.
Oh.
That's okay. It's a really big question, what happens when we die. And I feel that luckily, I feel in my experience, I can actually touch on what everybody's already said a little bit. So I worked for quite a long time as a chaplain in a care home. So I spent a lot of time with older people who were dying, and I spent a lot of time being able to sit at their bedsides as they died. So what Lisa has said is what I've seen countless times, that people become very sleepy, they're very relaxed. You know, we've got a lot of medication. That means that people don't have to be in pain or any discomfort. And then they just gently take one last breath, and that's it. It's a very, very natural process. It's a process like being born is a process. Dying is a similar process. And then I've worked with a lot of families to help them decide what happens next to their loved one, and so worked with a number of funeral directors. So what Alex has said is exactly right. The person who has died will be normally taken into the care of a funeral director. Where that person has died, it's not an emergency when someone dies naturally. So you don't need to ring an ambulance straight away or to ring a funeral director straight away. And if you want to keep your loved person at home, you can do. They don't have to. It would only be if a coroner was involved, if the death was unexpected. But other than that, you can keep your person at home with you if you want to for a number of hours or any time longer than that. And then hopefully what would be great is if people have made plans beforehand about what they would want to happen to them when they die. I talk about what you would like to happen to your body when you're no longer using it. So, you know, when, as Katy said, when we die, the person isn't in that body anymore. So what do I want to happen to my body when I'm no longer using it? And I'll have had those discussions, and so I might have that written down, and I might have a family member or somebody else who I trust to be able to look after that and work with a funeral director or whoever to make those things happen. I am a religious person, I'm a Christian, so I believe that there are other things that happen to us as our spirit and the person that we are. But they're my beliefs, and I'm never going to push that on anybody else. And I've worked with people of lots of different beliefs, and a lot of people take comfort from having a belief that they go on into something else after we die. And whatever that is, whatever faith position you have, that can bring comfort. I've got a really good friend who doesn't believe anything like that at all, but she finds comfort in the fact that she says, well, when I die, I'll go in the ground and the worms will eat me. And she really likes that thought of nourishing the ground again and going back into nature. But so yeah, quite a few different answers in that one, but I hope that helps.
No, it helps completely. Great.
I think that planning's really interesting, isn't it, Emma? And I think, you know, we're all going to die at some point, aren't we? And I think the kind of place that we live now, we've stopped talking about death and dying so much. So it sometimes can be hidden away, can't it? A little bit talking about it. But I don't know if anyone else has seen this, the more that people talk about it, the more it becomes normal to have those conversations, and you don't upset people around you. Mm-hmm. And it really helps people afterwards when you have died, if they can look after what your wishes would be.
Yes.
And try and respect those wishes if possible.
Can I say about my dad's experience?
Yeah.
So my dad found out that he was ill with cancer, and he was told to expect he probably would live for another 12 months, which is pretty much exactly what happened. And that was a shock. It was a shock for my dad. It was a shock for our family. But that 12 months also became really important. So I think where people get to experience an ordinary death, it was so good to be able, like Dad wanted to talk about dying, and he wanted to talk about his funeral. And because we were already quite open as a family, we just went with it. And that allowed us to get creative with some of the remembering, like looking back on a life well lived. Yeah. So for Dad in that last year, it was like his body was dying, but he was living, you know, like it was really great. And he wanted to be involved in making decisions about what happened, and he changed his mind. So he'd always said, when I die, I'll be cremated, which means having your body go into effectively a big oven, and your body your dead body is burned into ashes. So he'd always said that. And it wasn't quite what me and my sister were interested in, but we were like, yeah, okay, Dad. And then during that last year, you know, he was a man who loved bird watching and walking in the Peak District. And he just sort of said, why do I want to be cremated? Can we go and visit some natural burial grounds? Which are, so in Stoke-on-Trent where we lived, there was a woodland burial area within the council cemetery. Yeah. So we went and visited that, and it was an old oak woodland, and he was just like, this is for me, I want to be buried here. And that goes back to what Emma was saying about the dead body being returned to the earth, becoming soil, working with you know, the life that lives in the soil to break down and become. And I'll end this anecdote with, so where Dad's buried, like it's not manicured, it's not like tidy, it's like wild woodland. And so brambles grow over his grave. And like he's been dead for just over 2 years now. So we're going to go back and we're going to pick the blackberries that grow above the grave, and we're going to make brandy jam for the grandchildren, which is not, it won't really be my dad as jam, but it'll be the I love that his body has nourished the earth and then is adding to life above the soil. So for us as a family, that's really comforting.
So the second question is, what does a good death mean to you in your world? So I'll start with you, Emma. What's a good death mean to you in your world?
Okay, so I think we need to look at the term good death, because some people like it, some people find it difficult because they'll go, well, how can death be good? So I like to think more about dying well, so that the bit that we do as we die, for me, it would be about having the things that I want to happening. And the only way I think we can have that is if we plan ahead. So I've got a death folder, and every time I go away, I make sure my mum and dad have my death folder. My mum hates it. And I'm only 44, and I've not got any particular life-limiting conditions. I'm not expecting to die anytime soon, but anything could happen. So I always make sure people know where my death folder is. And in that, it's really comprehensive. It's got everything from, if I die today, do the people I live with know what day the bins go out? Or, you know, when the MOT is due on the car. The practical bits of information that I keep in my head, but that somebody else would need to know. It's got all the information in about my digital life, because so many of us now, we're all online, whether that's our social media accounts or if it's our bank accounts and all that kind of stuff. So what do I want to happen, and who's going to control that, and how are they going to access my online stuff? And then the really important bit is advanced care plans. And in that, it talks about what I want to happen to me if I can't tell you anymore. So if something happens and I'm not able to tell you what I want, my plan states that really well, how I want to be looked after. Things like, if I'm in bed, I want you to tie my hair on top of my head like a pineapple, because I hate my hair in my face when I'm in bed. So really specific things. But in order for those kind of things to be able to happen, I've also got lasting power of attorneys in place. And these are really important legal documents where I choose who I want to make decisions on my behalf if I can't make those decisions anymore. And there's two different kinds. There's one for health and welfare, and so if I can't make those decisions, so I either can't communicate or my brain's not working in a way that I can tell people what I want, then those people who are my attorneys can then say, well, we know what Emma wants because she's written it all down. And they then have a legal right to make that decision. Because without a lasting power of attorney in place, nobody has a legal right to make decisions for you. Doctors will usually talk to your family and will take that on board, but your family don't have that legal right. So I have those documents in place. And I've chosen two people who are two of my best friends who know me really well and who will stand up for what I want. And then, so my death file has that information in, and then it has information in about my will, what I want to happen to my property after I die, and what I want to happen to my body after I die. So what kind of funeral I might want and all of those kind of things. So for me, to die well is having all of that information in place and knowing that it's going to be read and people are going to follow what I've said I wanted. But ultimately, dying well for me would probably look like I'd like to be at home in my own bed. I'd like my dogs to be able to be with me. And I want absolute Radio 90s on. None of this classic FM stuff. You know, I want absolute Radio 90s on. And I want a really nice cup of tea, if I'm still able to drink, and a rum and ginger ale. And if I can have all of those things and I can die peacefully at home, then I'll have died really well. But I do know that not everything goes according to plan. So my plan has in place, well, if I can't have that, this would be okay. And if I can't have that, this would be okay. And then ultimately the things that I really don't want to happen. But yeah, that's what dying well or a good death would look like for me.
That's really good.
So it's really interesting actually that, because I think some of the things that you've mentioned there around, I think it's mentioned there like an advance statement.
Yes.
So an advance statement is how you record your wishes for your care and care during and after death. But we've done some work a little while back where we did a easy read version of that.
Brilliant.
And it's on the Deciding Right website. So I know we've touched on that in the past with the work with the group, but the Deciding Right website has a lot of easy read information, different formats to make gathering that information more accessible. And all those versions sit within there. So that's a good place for people to look if they want some additional support with just completing documents. Mm-hmm. And those documents then can be shared, and this is the other important part.
Absolutely.
And I think your file sounds a really good idea. But the other thing we can do with those documents, and you've helped develop the work for it, haven't you, Anthony, around emergency healthcare plans, I know that, is they sit on your medical record. So you can have them stored with your GP, and they can share those documents as well with North East Ambulance Service. So if people get called in an emergency or your GP, that information sits there within your medical record. So it's just knowing that you can do that as well is really helpful.
So important.
So I think anywhere you can put that information is always a good idea, because as we know, systems and record keeping and things sometimes break down, but knowing that your GP can store that information for you. The lasting power of attorney, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because that is legally binding. And as a doctor, I think people believe that your next of kin would be able to say what should happen to you medically, but they can only advise. They can't kind of insist that things happen unless you have a lasting power of attorney for health. And then that's as if you were there speaking. If you couldn't speak yourself, the first thing is always to check with the person. But if you can't speak yourself, your lasting power of attorney could do that. But it's just where to share that information is really important too.
Absolutely.
So Katy, what are you?
So I think I'll talk through like my ideal good death for me. So I hope that I will die at home. I hope that it will be an expected death so that people know it's coming. It's not a shock to my friends and family. I hope that it's not painful, or that any discomfort can be managed. Not necessarily medically, but through other massage and aromatherapy and that kind of thing. So before I did this kind of work, I honestly hadn't thought about what a good death would mean for me. But I do have an idea of what that would look and feel like. And some of that's for me as a dying person and then as a dead person. But some of it's for my family as well, and what a good death, my good death would look like for my family. So for me, this is very me. I'm thinking about the staging of the room. So if it was my bedroom, I'd want mood lighting. I'd want fairy lights. I'd want candles. I'd want plants around me. Don't have any pets at the moment, but if we're cat people, so if we'd got cats, I'd want my cats around. And I'd want it to be calm, and I'd want it to be quiet. So these are things that are important to me in life. And I don't know how I'll feel when I'm dying, but I suspect I will really want those kind of sensory, things that are important to me and that make me feel relaxed and happy. And then when I'm dead, again, I'd like my family not to feel rushed into making decisions. I've said in my plan that I'd be happy for my body to be kept at home for a couple of days. So for me, a good death is about family and friends, involvement, pre-planning, and time, there being relaxed time. Yes.
And I think it's really important to say that there's nothing scary about a dead body. There's nothing dangerous about a dead body. So you can absolutely keep a body at home and spend time with it. I remember when my nana died, which was about 6.5 years ago, she died at home. And when I got there, I went to go, all of the family were there and I was the last to arrive. And I went to go upstairs and my sister went, no one's seen her yet. And I said, okay. And my mum went, but it's okay, you can go up. And I went up and I would always get into bed with my nana, and I would lie in bed with her and I'd read stories together and we'd just spend time together. So she was in bed and I went up and I went and lay in bed with her for 5 minutes or whatever. And after that, I went downstairs and everyone went, what does she look like? And I went, she just looks like she's asleep. And my nana used to sleep with her mouth open anyway. And it looked like she'd probably had a bit of Ribena. So her mouth was a little bit purpley. That's all. And I just went, she just looks like she's asleep. And one by one, everybody went up and saw her and had some time with her. And there's nothing scary about it. And I remember saying to someone afterwards, I said, I spent that time with my nana. I know nana wasn't really there because this is what we're kind of taught to believe, that the person is gone. And this is the person said to me, but the part of your nana that used to hug you was still there. And I said, yeah, you're right.
That's really important, isn't it? Because I think when people are dead and their body's there, there's also sometimes an expectation that you'll go and visit or view the body. And I think we're all individuals, and so what's right for one person might not be right for another, but sometimes there's a pressure, isn't there, that either not to view the body or to view it. And I've seen people kind of do both in a situation when they haven't been happy to go and view the body, and actually it probably would have been the right thing for them not to see that body after death, because some people find it easier to remember the person when they were alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I, obviously as a funeral doctor, I see visitation to chapels of rest on a regular basis, but also in people's homes. And I've often said, it's the unknown that we're fearful of often.
Yes.
And actually, you've just said it in a way. Your nana was asleep.
Yeah.
You know, how often do you see a loved one, asleep, fully dressed often, and in a coffin? Okay, in your situation, she was in bed.
Yeah.
But all of those things are just completely just not everyday occurrences for any of us.
Yeah.
So to then walk into a premises of a funeral doctor that is potentially scary, or the unknown of what's behind that door and that door.
Yeah.
And I was always trained that it's important to just advise family what's behind the next door in a really nice way.
Yeah.
This is where your nana's going to be. This is where your loved one's going to be. You know, you're not just going to walk in, they're going to be stood up or anything scary like that.
Yeah.
It's just sort of just breaking down those fears and saying, and reassuring and saying, I'll be here. I'll leave the door open. There's no obligation to go in the room. Take your time. And that's really important to tell people to take their time. Because if you just shove somebody into a room, that's going to terrify anybody, you know, adults or children. You know, quite often this could be their first time of actually seeing a dead person.
Yes.
And if it's that memory of like, well, I don't know what to expect, first of all, because they may not have been present at the point of death. So they don't know what to expect. But they've got all this bank of memories from when that person was alive and giving them hugs and things and all those happy times. And I've often said that our faces have so many muscles in them that give us a frown, a smile, a cross face or whatever. All of that fades away.
Yeah.
And as funeral doctors and embalmers, we can't reinstate any of those emotions in the face. So the face looks fairly flat and emotionless. So there isn't a smile and there isn't a smirk.
I think having these conversations today, it's a really good chance to sort of just say to people, don't ever be afraid to ask, even if you think it's weird, it's very likely not going to be, and people will support you to make it happen.
Yes.
Absolutely. It can be sometimes as simple as saying to someone, how was their hair held? You know, for example, you've got a fringe, but if I brushed that right back and your forehead was on show, and all of a sudden it's like, I've never seen your forehead in 20 years, you know.
I need to write that in my plan.
There you go.
The fringe.
You know, and
No, it's really
it's little
important.
details that create a much bigger picture about the person, who they were as a person.
Yes.
And it's important as funeral doctors that we ask those questions, because family won't necessarily know to say, oh, by the way, the hair was in this position or that position.
Alex, I wondered whether it would be useful to say something about, maybe not in terms of your own, but you've worked with a lot of families, about what embalming is and why for some people embalming might be an important part of how they perceive a good death.
Yeah. So I am a qualified embalmer as well as a qualified funeral doctor. So, and in terms of embalming, it's modern day embalming. A lot of people think, what is embalming? And they kind of go back to what they've learned in school about the Egyptians and embalming, and it's nothing like that whatsoever. So any pre-thoughts like that. And it's really about the presentation of a person, the sanitation, so cleaning of a person, so washing the person down fully. And then the last one is really preservation, which is we're not really trying to keep somebody for a really long period of time, but long enough to the day of the funeral, allowing a family the least amount of changes that may occur after death. And it's really sort of preparing them in a way that we use embalming chemicals to replace the blood and to prevent any deterioration of the dead body, and to allow the family that opportunity to come in. They may be away, they may be on holiday, they might be coming for the day of the funeral, for example, because they live on the other side of the world, and therefore may not have had that opportunity to be present at the point of death or have that chance beforehand. So embalming will allow that period of time. but it's always an option to the family. It's not an obligation. Just because you want to view someone doesn't mean they have to be embalmed. It's really important to know that.
I think it's really important as well to say that the more we educate people about the fact that our bodies do change after we've died, and that if somebody hasn't been embalmed and there are some changes, a good funeral director would normally say to you, Mum now doesn't look her best. There are some changes. But what they can't say is, you can't see her now.
Absolutely.
They'll say, there might have been some changes in colour or this kind of event, and you can say, can you just tell me exactly what, and they can describe it, and then you can decide, I still want to see Mum, even though, you know, for Dead Good, for Katy and Lindsay, one of their slogans is, it's okay to decay, because that's what our bodies do when we're buried. And that's what's starting to happen as our bodies break down. And absolutely, it might not be very comforting for you to go and see, you know, Mum or Grandma or whoever, and that process have started, so that you might not want to see that. But if we know that that's normal, then it's not as scary.
So for me, a good death really starts with knowing the person as much as we can. So I kind of want to know what makes that person happy, what makes them sad, where do they live, what's their setup at home, who supports them, who knows all about them, what's important to them. Because if I start to understand those things, then I can help support a good death. Without that, if you haven't got that information, I think you might be guessing. And I know as a doctor, when I guess, I usually get it wrong. So for me, I like to know everything. I'm really nosy. And I am always thinking, right, I need to make sure that this person and their family and care team are prepared. And we've talked about being prepared a lot of the time, haven't we? And I'm planning for the worst things that might happen, but hoping for the best. So in my planning for the worst things, in my doctor role, I need to think about things that might go wrong. So I need to know all that medical information. I need to know kind of what they take, what they don't, tablet and medicine-wise, and try and prepare and make sure that's all thought about before that person maybe can't swallow and manage medication. I need to think about and help them think about, and again, their carers and their care team, about emergencies that might happen. So again, I'm preparing for this death and always hoping for the best, which is, you know, we talked about just becoming more and more sleepy and then the brain not working and not being able to wake up. But sometimes, because I look after people with life-limiting diseases, so things that they're not going to get better from, I know emergencies might happen, so I do a lot of preparation around that. And I have to know that person, and again, their carers and their care team. Is that going to happen in their own home? Is it, you know, whether that's their own private home or residential care setting or a nursing home? Or would that be better for that to happen for that person in a hospital maybe? Or in a hospice? And I've always got my plan A's and my plan B's. So I kind of like have the best case scenario, and I also have to have a backup plan, because we all know kind of within health services and home settings, things sometimes just don't work. So for me, a good death's all about preparation.
I think if I'm leading a funeral service as a celebrant, I always talk about how we move forward with the space that that person has left in our lives. The space that the person that we know and love who has died, that they had in our lives, that space will always be there. Over time, our lives get bigger and more full, and we don't feel that space as much, but maybe at Christmas we really notice that person's missing, or maybe there's something happens and I just want to tell that person that I did this, and that space feels bigger. So we carry that space forever, and sometimes we feel it more than others, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that, like you say, with grief and bereavement. It never goes away, it's always there, we just don't always feel it as extreme as other times.
And one of the things when Lisa was talking, I thought about the death cafes that I've been hosting over the last year, and an emotion that came up time and time again in the death cafes that I wasn't expecting, and that was anger. And I think for me, it's really important that we talk openly and compassionately about death and dying, but also talking about the emotions attached to that. I think people expect sadness, don't they?
Yeah.
And then, like Anthony was saying earlier, like that can feel, if you suddenly don't experience that, or what you're experiencing is different to what your family's experiencing. Again, I'm interested in there being more openness around the different kinds of emotions that might be experienced at different times. And none of them are wrong, but some might need more support or guidance around that.
You need to know it's okay, don't you?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes talking to people and saying, it might just hit you out of the blue.
Yeah.
You might find yourself in Asda about to get a tin of beans off the shelf, and then suddenly you think about that person and that emotion hits you. You can't control when emotions hit you.
Music's another one.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
So people have picked certain music for the funeral service, and they're picking the beans off the shelf in Asda, and all of a sudden the music track that was at the funeral comes on. It's just an emotional trigger that takes them immediately back to the funeral, and it can be something as simple as that. And I think it's the good death kind of can be brought into the funeral as well. Absolutely. Sort of like what's a good funeral, and actually personalising, but not through cost. So a certain type of colour or choice of clothing. I mean, years ago I had one, it was everyone to be in tracksuits because they didn't like suits. Or everyone to be in the Newcastle kit or something, or or a flash of colour of yellow or something that was their favourite colour. And it's those personalisations that really do make a funeral personalised and a good funeral for the family and that celebration of life.
Yeah, and I think breaking down the elements of a funeral, so people often think there's a coffin and there's flowers. But if your person didn't like flowers or didn't want the expense spent on flowers, what else can we put on top of a coffin? So I've done funerals where we've had a snowboard and snowboard boots. I did one where a gentleman always had this red thermos flask with him. So on top of his coffin was his thermos flask, his jar of coffee and his glasses. And when my friend's dad died a year and a bit ago, he hated waste. And he always said, I don't want flowers at my funeral. But he'd been an avid allotment keeper. So we made a big display of vegetables to go on top of his coffin. But the rule was that if you come to the wake afterwards, you have to take some veg home and make Don soup. So we all made Don soup because he was like, I don't want waste. So you don't have to go through, well, this is what you have to have. What can we put on top instead? What do we have to have anything there?
And I also love that Alex has kind of made the point that a good funeral doesn't mean an expensive funeral. And that, those personal touches don't have to cost anything. They just require imagination. And so like for my dad, who was a bird watcher, we asked everyone that was coming to the funeral to bring a found feather. So something that if we encourage people to get out and think about my dad. And because this was during COVID times as well. So when people were on their walks, daily walks, if they found a feather on the walk, pick it up and bring it to the funeral. And of course, when we were communicating this, there were people that weren't going to be at the funeral, but were going to watch it live streamed. And they sent us feathers that they'd found through the post.
When you see a feather now, do you have a little kind of association?
It's funny, isn't it? Because I know a lot of people do as well, that when they see a little feather, that it makes them feel connected to someone who's died. And I personally don't get that experience, but I love that those sort of natural moments do make people, for me, it would be more hearing birds in the trees.
Mine's rainbows. So when I came back from my grandma's funeral, we were driving back and across the road was a full rainbow.
Wow.
And I was like, oh. And everyone was like, because we were all on our phones, has anyone just driven through a rainbow? We're like, yes. And then when my granddad died, so her husband, double rainbow. And I get goosebumpies now thinking about it straight away. So whatever, rainbows for me is kind of a bit of a message. I'm not religious, but I do kind of have, I guess, spiritual beliefs.
I'm open,
So we would like to ask, what is a coroner?
A coroner. When someone has died and it's not been clear how they've died, or they've not seen a doctor in a short amount of time before that, then they'll be sent to the coroner, who is a doctor who makes the decisions and investigates how that person has died. But for more information, there will be an easy read guide that will be linked in the show notes.
So Katy, what is a death cafe?
So a death cafe, death cafes, it's a national model of cafes. They take place in community centres, real cafes, they can take place in people's homes, but they are free events that take place all over the country. So I've been running some in Sunderland. We know there's been one recently in South Shields. That there are ones that run in Cullercoats and Newcastle. So maybe we'll put in the show notes the Death Cafe website, so you can have a look and find out where the nearest one to you is. But a death cafe, essentially, it's a space that's hosted by two neutral people who, for 2 hours, allow people to come and talk about anything they want about death, dying or grief. There's no agenda, there's no speakers. It's very much people come as fellow human beings and they talk about experiences, questions, things they're worried about. And what I know from having run them is every single cafe is completely different because what you talk about depends on the people who come to the sessions. But the important things are they are free, they'll always be in accessible settings, and I really encourage people to try them.
Tea and cake.
There'll always be
Cake,
refreshments
coffee
as well.
mornings.
Yes.
So Lisa, what is a hospice?
A hospice is a building, and what happens there is people can come and have care if they have life-limiting illnesses, so conditions that they're not going to get better from and they may die from. So sometimes people come for very short periods of time, and sometimes they kind of might come and even see us for some symptom control. Some of them might get their pain made better and then go back off living back at home. The hospice, because it is a building, will hold lots of different healthcare professionals who work in a big team. And the hospice I work in, we work in the community. So me and my nurses and other team members will go and see people at home. And then also the team will work in the hospital. So we've got kind of like a mini hospice team working in the hospital. And then we also have an inpatient unit where people come, for an admission like you would go into hospital. Yeah. So they might come for a week, 2 weeks. Sometimes people come to die and to be looked after when they're dying. I mean, I could talk for ages about this. We've also got day services. So when people keep living at home, but they come in for the day to get some things sorted out and then go back home. And I'll have probably forgotten half of the team because it's massive. But basically, we provide care for people with life-limiting disease in a building called a hospice. Yeah. And then we go to wherever that person is.
So it's a bit like a building where you can actually go in for a day, or you're having a bit of overnight.
Yeah, or you might come in for a week, 2 weeks. But the buildings...
Get some help.
Yeah, get some help. That's exactly right, yeah.
And it can be, I think particularly where the dying is happening quickly, that sometimes hospice is a good option where families aren't coping well at home.
So it can be a good place for support and care, yeah.
So that's really good. Thank you very much.
And I've got a information leaflet they will attach as well.
That's good.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Alex, so what exactly do you mean when body comes into care?
So into care is unlike a care facility like a hospital or hospice. The care is in the care of the funeral director's premises. So in the care of the funeral director in this case. So the dead body comes from the place where they've died into the care of the funeral director's premises, where they have the temperature control facility to look after the family's relative until the day of the funeral. So it's really kind of where preparation upon the family's wishes can take place, whether the deceased is to be taken back to the family home, to stay at the family home, or to be in the chapel arrest to the day of the funeral. But the care is really the care of the funeral director.
I think of it as once the person's died, the funeral director looks after the dead body kindly, respectfully, at your funeral director building.
Yeah, it's very much like that. You know, it's important that funeral directors have that level of care and dignity, you know, to look after someone's loved one, because we have been entrusted with their nearest and dearest to look after them and sort of make sure that they're kept safe till the day of the funeral.
So we're kind of run out of time. So I just want to say thank you all so much for joining me in this wonderful podcast and discuss about death and dying and sharing your opinion of the questions. And it's been absolutely amazing having you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
So thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode and are feeling very kind, please rate, review and subscribe, and be sure to tell your family and friends to have a listen too. The music you've heard in these episodes was composed for us by O'Hooley and Tito and published by Voice Publishing. If you'd like to listen to the full song, you can find the link in the show notes. And if you'd like to share your ordinary life with us, we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on social media at ordinarylife66. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to catch up with you again soon.